It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Dr. Khara Grieger. She's currently an assistant professor and an extension specialist in environmental health and risk assessment. We're going to talk about her work with various stakeholders that have to deal with nanomaterials that are used in food and agricultural sectors and how they affect the environment. So, Khara, thank you for coming. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, and I didn't mention you're at North Carolina State University. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. NC State.
Okay. Well, if you would tell me a bit about your background and then your current research.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks. So for my background, I actually have a PhD in environmental engineering, where I've focused on understanding risks of engineered nanomaterials and ways that we can understand these risks that often have uncertainty associated with them. At that time, I was at the Technical University of Denmark outside of Copenhagen, where I lived and worked for about a decade, trying to understand risk assessments of emerging technologies. And then I moved to the U.S. After my PhD and postdoc work. So I've taken some of my background in risk assessment of engineered nanomaterials and nanotechnology, and then have applied those tools and thinking to investigating some potential risks and decision-making of nanomaterials in food and agrisystems. Which that's one of the projects I'm working on now.
All right. So what kind of nanomaterials are people having issues with, and which ones are you studying?
Oh, thanks for asking. So let me just back up. So there's a range of different nanomaterials that are being developed and used in different food and agricultural products. So these would range from different nanomaterials used in agriculture, like nanopesticides, nanofertilizer, to different types of nanomaterials in food, including food additives and different nutritional supplements. And also nanomaterials are being used in veterinary medicine applications as well. And I must say that I think there a lot of these emerging research areas are also trying to be more sustainable with the use of nanotechnology in food and agriculture. So there's a big emphasis of trying to use and harness some of the unique properties of nanomaterials and nanotechnologies for more sustainable food and ag systems. At the same time, there are some stakeholders that are not sure how they feel about using this in food and agriculture. And so there are different stakeholders. They have different views of the use of nanomaterials and food and ag products. And what we've seen in some of our research is that different or some stakeholders are more comfortable with the use of nanomaterials for agricultural applications, particularly those that respond to a societal benefit. And at the same time, stakeholders are a little bit less comfortable or less sure about using nanomaterials directly in food that would be directly ingested.
What is a nanomaterial, though? Is it nano-sized beads of material that are used, or does it start out, as a nanomaterial and then it becomes larger clumps? Like, what does that mean that something's a nanomaterial?
That's a great question. So actually, we use nanomaterials in a number of different ways in societies. Actually, nanomaterials can be natural, but what I'm talking about is really engineered nanomaterials. So these would be materials that are purposely engineered and developed on the nanoscale. That is 10 to the minus ninth meters at a very, very small, we're talking like atomic scale. And actually at this scale, materials can end up having some slightly different, or they do have different properties. So they can behave in a different way than at the bulk scale. And that's why we're scientists and researchers have been interested in using and harnessing some of their unique properties in different applications.
Oh, so what's an example of a common nanomaterial where there's a lot of debate about its use, but it's also important at the same time?
That's a great question. What are those examples where there might be potential benefits, but also potential risks or concerns? One that comes to my mind, and there are a number of different examples here, but one that comes to my mind is the use of titanium dioxide or nano dioxide as a food additive. So I'll back up and say that titanium dioxide, or E171, is already an approved food additive. We've been using it for decades. It's often to make foods different, or to make foods brighter or whiter. You can look on the back of, a pack of candies, gum. You can easily find dioxide in the list of ingredients as E171. Now, there's some work on the use of engineered nanomaterials that would be at the nanoscale, and whether nanoscale titanium dioxide would be considered to be different as non-nanoscale. And to make a long story short, the European Food Safety Authority has recently decided to discontinue the use of titanium dioxide in all foods because largely of toxicology studies using engineered nanomaterials. So in terms of the benefits, who benefits from using titanium dioxide in foods? For the most
that
part,
I see everywhere. Now that I think about it, I've seen that on many, many labels.
Yeah, that's correct. And we actually have a number of different food additives. If you start looking on the packages of different food and beverages, there are a lot of different food additives that we do use regularly in society. And E171 is one of them. Europe has decided to take a slightly different approach and decided to discontinue its use as an approved food additive, as I said, largely because of some toxicology studies involving nanoscale titanium dioxide. And so who benefits, from using TiO2? Well, in my opinion, or in my mind, I think that maybe perhaps food companies, and you could maybe claim consumers if they would have a brighter colored food product or brighter colored candy, maybe it looks more attractive.
Quick question here. Besides making things, let's say, whiter or different colors, what are other uses of titanium dioxide? Because I've seen it, I believe, in sunscreen and food and other products. So it's probably has a lot of uses.
Yeah, it does have a lot of uses. Just off my top of my head, you mentioned some of them in sunscreen and different personal care products. I think in toothpaste. It's also used in other things like that. So it is widely used in society. And so I think the question is, do the benefits outweigh the risk? And they often will depend on the actual product. And really, are those benefits, worth the potential risks? And so that those are decision-making questions that are often left to regulatory agencies.
Well, you mentioned stakeholders a bunch of times. So is there a hierarchy of claims or rights of stakeholders in the given situation? And is that taken into account when you evaluate, okay, well, this will help the manufacturer in this way, the product will last a week longer, but toxicologically it does this and that to people. So it's probably not worth it, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. To my knowledge, EPA definitely considers different stakeholder views of their approved uses. And so different benefits, are there economic benefits? If so, what are they? Who else benefits, who's at risk, all of this gets fed into an ultimate decision that's made by these regulatory agents.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I've used many of these products. I was never told one word about them. The titanium dioxide or other additives show up on the label, but I don't know what they do unless I research them, and I don't even know they're there unless I look at it. So
Correct.
how am I, for instance, as a consumer of a product, how am I a stakeholder if I don't know anything?
Oh, that's a really good and deep question. And that relates to a lot of things that go beyond just nanomaterials, the role of product labeling. So you do have the list of ingredients on food, and consumers can try to read those labels and to educate themselves on what those labels mean. At the same time, we know that scientists and regulatory authorities are also working hard to make sure those labels are clear and transparent and understandable. I know that FDA, for example, they have done quite a lot of work in trying to improve some of their food labeling to make sure that consumers have transparent and informative information so they can make the best decisions that they can. So food labeling is definitely a way that we can try to get consumers to understand more of their purchasing, what they are purchasing. But I agree with you that there's a lot there that would go on to informing the consumer about all the details of what are different food additives, what are their safety. I think a consumer might need to dig a little bit deeper to try to understand some of the information, and some of this information might be available through websites or other materials produced by regulatory authorities. So, for example, the CSPI, Center for Science in the Public Interest, they do quite a lot of interesting work to try to make sure that consumers have sufficient information to make decisions about the food they're consuming.
Okay. I was thinking about the food labels that you talked about. Why can't there be a requirement, let's say, to have a QR code or a URL on given products? So not only that, they would go to a video and say, here's all the ingredients listed in order of, concentration, and here's what they do, and here's why we included them. What if there was a required statement that needed to be made by various products that way?
That's a great idea. I think some different groups have suggested similar strategies, that maybe a QR code could be applied to different products where a consumer could scan the QR code to get some more information. I'm not a total expert in this, but I think that what I've understood is that it may put some additional burden on companies to add in a different QR code to the label. And then how does one, or who is responsible for maintaining the information that would be linked to that QR code? Is that additional burden for companies, or whose responsibility? So this question here really gets at the heart of a lot of my research that focuses on how can we manage these emerging technologies in society, and it comes to who is responsible. And often it's a multi-stakeholder approach, or several stakeholders are responsible, right? You have responsibility of industry, you have responsibility of regulatory authorities. You could also argue that consumers may have some responsibility in themselves with their purchasing power. So there's a lot of different groups that would be important when we think about who is responsible for managing some of the emerging technologies or risks in our.
Yeah, I just don't see it being very much of a burden. If I'm going to make a new, suntan lotion, I have to go through some regulation to get it put onto the market. Now, obviously, it can't hurt people and needs to be tested. So why is it so much harder for me to put a QR code in a video that someone in my organization keeps up? I'm making a lot of money on the product, hopefully. I have good margins. So I don't know. It just seems like if industry gives that excuse, it's like, come on, you guys made it. You know what's in it. You deliberately chose the ingredients to be in it for reasons, but you can't say all that in the video. Like, please. So I don't know. I just think if there was a law that required something like that, something really simple, it shouldn't be too much of a hardship on the companies.
Right. Well, that's interesting. You brought up a good point about a company or an industry's ability to be transparent and forthcoming with some of the information in their products. And what we have seen in some other spaces, well, actually in the nano space as well as in the genetic engineering space, but I have seen some companies be more forthright about, their use. They specifically state that they are using nanoscale materials in some cases, and they try to, discuss how nanomaterials are used, how it brings benefit to the product. And the same for the genetic engineering space. So there are definitely some companies that we've seen that are purposely trying to describe to consumers how they're using new genetic engineering techniques to improve the product. So I think that in some cases we have seen that, and I think those industries are trying to build trust with consumers, that they're not trying to hide anything. They want to be forthright about what they are using and maybe how it benefits the consumer. And I may have mentioned earlier that some of my research has shown that consumers are more excited about the use of nanomaterials in agriculture and those that would solve a societal problem than other applications that may be just more frivolous or like for look or taste or something like that. And so this points out to some other research that shows that when there are, a distribution of benefits and risks with emerging technologies in food and ag, that consumers want products that generally have a higher benefit to risk ratio, and that there's really a need for it in society that solves a bigger challenge and it responds to a larger societal need, such as being more sustainable, having a positive impact on the environment or human health, again, where there's a clear benefit to.
Well, a lot of products, I mean, I don't know, like if there's a new potato chip that tastes like, I don't know, broccoli, what's the societal benefit to that? Like, we don't need that necessarily. But if there's another product that's important for health, then it's a dramatically different application and need. So how is that being established when products are being made?
Well, if you have a number of companies that are trying to innovate in ways that are either more sustainable for the environment or provide additional health benefits. So actually, outside of nanomaterials, you probably have seen that the development and innovation of cell cultured meat is really on the rise. And that has a number of positive environmental implications, including a positive impact on climate change, meaning that cell cultured meat would have a lower environmental impact when we talk about the climate compared to animal raised meat. And at the same time, there are also benefits for animal well-being and welfare that we wouldn't necessarily have to grow a whole animal and then kill it to, get the meat, that this would be another more animal welfare friendly type application. So we are seeing the growth of these more sustainable oriented food and ag innovations. There are also the rise of new genetic and food and agriculture, where perhaps folks can develop more nutritious fruits and vegetables, or develop, also in the case of nanomaterials, there's the use of potentially nanocellulose as a food coating on produce that could extend the shelf life and decrease food waste. So those are definitely the ideas that they would have a more significant impact in terms of being more environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, also what came to mind is the packaging for various, let's say, foodstuffs or materials. So, I don't know, if I have a drink that has all these great vitamins and minerals, probiotics and stuff in it, but if it's in a plastic bottle that has plasticizers, colors, all kinds of additives, and there's thousands of different chemicals in the bottle that it comes in, does that overwhelm my wish to create, let's say, a good product that's healthy for people, but yet it's in contact with this plastic bottle that does, and leach and form microplastics over time? Like, is the packaging coupled with the product? What about the delivery mechanism, the transport, the energy inputs, all that stuff? Is that considered?
Right, that's a great question. The tool that would be great for such a discussion or a question to ask would be something like life cycle assessment. So in the case of life cycle assessment, it's a tool that factors in a lot of different impacts. So whether it's impacts through climate change or ecotoxicity or toxicity aspects, you really need a tool that factors in all these different impacts across different criteria to really understand the full life cycle impact of that product. And so I can't, speak specifically unless we have a real case and we ran it through the type of like LCA to really see, the full impact. But that type of system level thinking is really important. It's going to be continually important as we move forward. I know in Europe that they want to pursue innovation in a way that's like more safe by design or safe and sustainable by design. So try to apply some green chemistry principles early on innovation, and then also couple it with some investigations into, what is the greenhouse gas impact of the new product that we're making. So yeah, life cycle assessment is going to be a great tool moving forward. I mean, I know we're supposed to be talking mainly about food and ag, but, if you look at electric vehicles, I believe, there's a whole conversation there about what is the full life cycle impact of with new electric vehicles. What are the impacts of using lithium batteries and other rare earth metals? So I'm not an expert at all in electric vehicles, but I just know that the use of life cycle assessment has been really important in framing that conversation. Or is it worth it? In the end, is it worth developing a new product that would have another set of environmental impacts compared to the conventional product?
Yeah, I read a book years ago called Cradle to Cradle, and it was about deliberately making products to be taken back by a manufacturer and possibly disassembled and the raw materials reused. Like they gave an example of a furniture company. I don't know the name, but they supposedly designed the furniture to take it back and again disassemble it and reuse it. Does any of that come into play with the types of products that you look at? Is anyone looking at that type of situation?
Yes, for sure. I don't work in LCA, but I know other groups who do, and that's the ideal situation, is that you have the circular economy, that we stop really innovating products that are more linear materials from the earth, and then we, landfill it. Like we want to disrupt that, and we want to create more circular economies. In fact, there's a lot of work going on in Europe again, that's trying to grow the circular economy. Yeah, so that's on the horizon. But I think, we still have a lot of challenges to be able to effectively do that. How can we really extract these different metals from these materials that are embedded with so many other materials, so we're really still working on how can we extract metals or materials or even things like nutrients like to be able to reuse it again. But it is the way that, especially because we just have one planet and we have a finite set of resources, and so we really need to be more mindful about reusing and having a more circular economy overall.
Is there a product that maybe you've been involved with or maybe not, but you think it's a really good example of all the stuff that you're talking about? It was well considered, it did involve various people and interests that contributed to its design and its use. Any good examples out there, or are things so new and so underdeveloped that there aren't yet good examples?
That's a great question. Other folks have asked me that as well. Like, what's a great example of a sustainable product or a product that has been responsibly innovated? And some of the responses that I have received from others I would say it's almost like the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What is deemed is sustainable may be different depending on certain viewpoints. And there's so many different factors to consider. And in some ways, I don't know if there would be an ultimate product that is, poster child of sustainability. We definitely see a lot of examples on the other end of the spectrum where things have just really not gone as expected, whether they're in the environment, impacts to human health, whether societal voices and perspectives were, not included very robustly. So we see a lot of, what not to do. So unfortunately, I can't really give you a great example of a sustainable product right now, but I'll be happy to continue to think about that and get back with if I identify one.
Okay. Well, very good. Khara, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and keep tabs? Where can they go?
Yeah, so I have some information online. If you just Google me, you can find my profile at NC State. I also have my group website up. It's called, my research group is called the Interview Group at NC State. And I'm involved in a number of different projects that also have their own website, including the Genetic Engineering and Society Center here at NC State, also part of a Science and Technologies for Phosphorus Center or STEP Center at NC State. So I feel like if anybody's interested in finding out more, just, you probably just can Google me. You'll find some sites and different information. You're also welcome to check out some of my publications that are on Google Scholar or elsewhere. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any additional questions if someone wants to contact me via email.
Excellent. Well, Khara, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.